Most people who seek spirituality are, in reality, running from one thing only: the responsibility of changing their lives. And this isn't a judgment, it's a pattern that repeats itself with impressive frequency. The person dives into practices, content, rituals, and philosophies, and stays in the exact same financial, emotional, and existential place they were before. Not because spirituality doesn't work, but because it's being used as a refuge, not as a tool for real transformation. What's going to be presented here will contradict much of what the spiritual market sells. There won't be a 7-step abundance formula, there won't be a miraculous visualization technique, and there won't be a promise that simply raising your vibration will make money appear. What there will be is something far more valuable and far more uncomfortable. The truth about what really separates those who expand their consciousness and transform their own lives from those who merely consume spiritual content and remain exactly where they are. Itzhak Bentov spent years investigating how human consciousness works, how it perceives reality, and how it can be expanded beyond the limits that most people never even question. And one of the most disturbing discoveries from that study is that scarcity, financial, emotional, relational, is not an external condition. It is an internal state that the person has learned to reproduce with frightening precision without realizing they're doing it. And as long as that state isn't recognized, questioned, and dismantled from the inside out, no external strategy will work in any sustainable way. This video was built for those who are tired of starting and never finishing, of getting inspired and never acting, of understanding everything in theory and seeing nothing change in practice. If at any point during this content you feel discomfort, resistance, or the urge to disagree, that is exactly the sign that something important is being touched. Because consciousness doesn't expand in comfort. It expands through honest contact with what hasn't truly been faced yet. What begins now is no longer motivational content. It's a map from the external world down to the deepest layers of the internal world for those who are willing to walk this path seriously and come out the other side with a completely different relationship with their own life. There's something nobody likes to hear, but that most people need to listen to before anything else. Visualizing wealth without taking action is one of the most sophisticated ways a person can deceive themselves. And the problem isn't that the person is bad, lazy, or incapable. The problem is that they were convinced the universe works like a request system, where all you have to do is tune into the right channel, close your eyes, visualize prosperity arriving, and wait. That idea became a product. It became an entire market. And that market sells emotional comfort, not real transformation. Itzhak Bentov spent years investigating how human consciousness functions, how it perceives reality, and how it can expand the reach of a person's perception well beyond what is considered possible. And one of the most important things that emerges from that study is precisely this. Consciousness is not passive. It doesn't sit and wait for the universe to act. Consciousness is an active force that observes, processes, decides, and moves the body toward what was intended. Separating intention from action isn't spirituality. It's paralysis dressed up as faith. The point here isn't to invalidate the power of the mind or to deny that a person's internal state profoundly influences the results they achieve. That is real, and it will be explored throughout this content with all the depth it deserves. The point is to understand that expanded consciousness doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates through a physical body, inside a concrete world, with real resources, real decisions, and real consequences. The bridge between the internal world and the external world has a name: deliberate action. And what happens very frequently is that the person discovers the law of attraction, dives into this idea that thought creates reality, and uses it unconsciously as a shield against the risk of acting and failing. Because if everything depends on vibration, then if things don't work out, the blame falls on the wrong vibration. If it didn't manifest, it's because they didn't energetically deserve it. It looks like spirituality, but underneath it's a limiting belief wearing new clothes. It's the fear of responsibility disguised as a spiritual practice. Genuine change begins at a very specific point. The moment a person stops using any belief, spiritual, social, familial, political, as an explanation for where they are, and decides that from here on out, what happens in their own life is their responsibility, not partially, totally. This doesn't mean ignoring the real difficulties that exist in everyone's path. It means that within what can be done, it will be done, with intention, not passive hope. This shift in mindset, as simple as it may sound to describe, is one of the hardest to actually go through, because it requires the person to look at their own patterns without defending them. It demands honesty, and honesty, when the person has spent years using beliefs as a shield, can hurt like surgery. But it's exactly at that point of honest pain that consciousness truly begins to wake up, not into a state of spiritual ecstasy, but into the full responsibility of being alive and wanting something different from what they have right now. And this is where it starts to get interesting, because once a person assumes that responsibility, they need to know what to do with it, and that requires something most people still profoundly underestimate. Assuming responsibility for your own life is the first real move. But responsibility without direction is wasted energy. And wasting energy is exactly what most people do after getting excited about a new idea. The excitement arrives, the motivation rises, and then the person sets enormous goals completely disconnected from where they actually are today. And within a few weeks, the enthusiasm evaporates because reality didn't respond at the speed they expected. This isn't a lack of faith, it's a lack of coherent planning. Dreaming big isn't the problem. The problem is confusing the destination with the next step. A person who is at financial ground zero doesn't need a plan to become a millionaire in 12 months. They need a plan to get off zero and reach level 1, and then from level 1 to level 2. Real growth works this way: progressive, cumulative, sustained. Each completed stage builds the structure that supports the next. Skipping stages isn't ambition, it's impulsiveness. And impulsiveness, in most cases, leads right back to the starting point, only now with more accumulated frustration. Bentov had a very precise way of understanding the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. He observed that the human mind, by its own nature, tends to project patterns, and that these patterns can either expand or restrict one's perception of what is possible. A mind that has learned to operate within contexts of scarcity will see the world through that filter. And when it sets goals, it tends to miss on both ends, either setting something so small it generates no movement, or something so far removed from current reality that it becomes a ghost, beautiful to contemplate, but impossible to reach from where the person actually stands. The balance between ambition and coherence isn't easy to calibrate, but there is a question that helps clarify it. What can be done in the next 30 days with the resources that exist right now that will put me in a better position than where I am today? That question forces the mind to leave the abstract and enter the concrete. It doesn't eliminate the big dream. It creates the real path to get there. And here is a point that few people take seriously. The frustration that paralyzes people doesn't come from failing to reach big goals. It comes from repeatedly failing at goals that were never realistically planned to begin with. The person creates an expectation disconnected from their context, doesn't achieve it, feels incapable, and uses that feeling as proof that they weren't born to have more. This cycle repeats for years, and the cycle doesn't break with more motivation. It breaks with a smaller, more specific, more executable goal, which when reached rebuilds the internal confidence that was corroded by so many failed attempts. Writing goals down on paper also isn't a detail. It's an act that most people ignore because it seems too simple, but one that radically changes a person's relationship with what they want. What stays only in the mind remains fluid, malleable, easy to abandon. What is written down becomes concrete, visible, verifiable. And the ability to review what was written, to look at what was planned and compare it to what was done, is what allows course corrections without having to start from scratch every time something doesn't go as expected. But planning well, writing goals, and being coherent with context only works fully when the mind is in a state where it can see beyond its own survival. And that state is far rarer than most people think. There is a mental state that functions as an invisible trap, and the person inside it rarely realizes they're caught. This state has a technical name in neuroscience, but in everyday life, it manifests in a very recognizable way. It's that constant feeling that things are always about to fall apart, that you can't relax because something is always going to go wrong, that life is an endless sequence of problems to solve before the next one arrives. This is survival mode, and a mind operating in this mode cannot plan clearly. cannot see opportunities, and, most importantly, cannot act strategically because all available energy is being used to contain what is already on fire. Bentov described in his studies how human consciousness has the capacity to perceive far more than it normally does, but that this capacity depends directly on the internal state the person is in. A mind in a state of constant alertness, what the nervous system calls fight-or-flight activation, literally narrows the field of perception. This isn't a metaphor, it's physiology. The brain in survival mode filters reality to see only threats because it was evolutionarily programmed to do so. The problem is that this mechanism, which was useful for escaping predators, becomes devastating when applied to financial life, relationships, and everyday decisions. Chronic anxiety does exactly this. It keeps the nervous system in a state of readiness that prevents the person from seeing beyond the immediate threat. And alongside anxiety, victimization often comes along. Not necessarily the kind the person expresses out loud, but the kind they feed internally, that silent narrative that circumstances are always larger than they are, that opportunities exist for others, that the system was built so that someone like them can't advance. That narrative is understandable. It is born from real experiences of difficulty, but it is also at the same time the chain that keeps the person in place. Getting out of that state is not a matter of pretending everything is fine or practicing a forced positivity that ignores real problems. It's a matter of developing what could be called active emotional regulation, the capacity to feel frustration, acknowledge it, without letting it govern you. Frustration is information. It points to something that isn't working and needs to change. But frustration that becomes identity, that becomes the story a person tells about themselves, stops being information and becomes an obstacle. The emotional control that truly transforms results isn't the kind that suppresses feelings. It's the kind that allows the person to feel without being consumed, and that frees the mind for a function that survival mode completely blocks. The ability to perceive what is available right now, with the resources that exist right now, that can be moved right now. Opportunities don't appear for those who are staring at the ground afraid of falling. They appear for those who lift their eyes and can see what's around them with some clarity. That clarity, once it begins to settle in, reveals something that most people underestimate in an impressive way. Something that has the power to change a person's trajectory far more deeply than any visualization technique or abundance ritual ever could. A mind that has left survival mode and begun to see what's around it with greater clarity will inevitably come face to face with a gap that nobody likes to admit they have. It's not a lack of faith, not a lack of motivation, and not a lack of spirituality. It's a lack of practical knowledge about how money actually works. And that gap, for as long as it remains unfilled, will continue sabotaging whatever progress the person tries to build, regardless of how many self-help books they read or how many morning meditations they do. The market for spiritual and motivational content has grown enormously over the past few decades, and much of what it sells is comforting. It makes the person feel good, elevated, connected to something greater, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem starts when this content replaces the concrete study of personal finance, investing, and financial psychology, rather than complementing it. The person consumes hours of content about abundance, vibrational frequency, and the law of attraction, but doesn't know the difference between an asset and a liability, doesn't understand how compound interest works, has no idea how to build an emergency fund or where to start investing with little money. Bentov understood that human consciousness operates in layers, and that expanding that consciousness means integrating dimensions that normally remain separate. The spiritual dimension and the practical dimension are not enemies. They are parts of the same system. A person who deeply develops their inner world while completely neglecting the outer world creates an imbalance that sooner or later manifests as frustration, stagnation, or financial collapse. The universe, so to speak, responds to the totality of who a person is, not just the part they choose to cultivate. Studying finance is not an act of materialism that contradicts spirituality. It's an act of responsibility toward your own life. Understanding how money moves, how it can be retained, multiplied, and intelligently distributed is a way of respecting your own effort and amplifying the impact of what you build. A person who earns well but doesn't know how to manage what they earn will remain in scarcity at a higher income. because the problem was never the amount of money coming in, but the relationship they have with it. Financial psychology enters here as an element that connects the inner world and the practical world in a very direct way. Spending patterns, impulsive decisions, the difficulty of saving money, the tendency to sabotage larger earnings, all of this has roots in beliefs formed since childhood, in messages absorbed about what money represents, about whether the person deserves abundance or not, about whether wealth is something for others or something they can build. Studying financial psychology is a way of making those beliefs visible, and what becomes visible can be worked on. The point isn't to become an economics expert or to master financial markets in 6 months. The point is to start. Read a book on personal finance. Understand the basics of interest, low-risk investments, and how to build a budget that doesn't suffocate, but also isn't ignored. This knowledge, even at an introductory level, changes the way a person makes decisions, and better decisions, made consistently over time, create results that no visualization alone could ever produce. But even with solid financial knowledge, even with coherent planning and developed emotional control, there is still one variable that most people underestimate. One that silently determines the ceiling of how far a person will go. There is a law that operates silently in everyone's life, and that doesn't depend on belief, spirituality, or any philosophical system to be valid. It simply works, whether the person is aware of it or not. This law says that the environment in which someone lives, the conversations that person has frequently, the values that circulate within the group they belong to, and the behavioral patterns they observe every day will inevitably shape the way they think, decide, and act. Not occasionally, constantly, and cumulatively, and Jim Rohn popularized the idea that you become the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. But this observation goes far beyond a motivational quote. It points to a real mechanism of how the human mind absorbs patterns from its surrounding environment. Human beings are deeply social and imitative by nature. The brain learns by observing. It absorbs behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and limits, and a significant part of this process happens below the level of consciousness, without the person realizing they're being influenced. Bentov, in exploring the nature of consciousness, identified that human perception is highly porous to the field it is immersed in. Consciousness doesn't operate in isolation. It is in constant exchange with the surrounding environment, capturing information, patterns, and frequencies that shape the way reality is perceived and interpreted. This means that a person can have every intention in the world to change, but if they remain immersed in an environment that reinforces the same limiting patterns they want to overcome, the battle is going to be much longer and much harder than it needs to be. This is not a call to abandon friends, cut off relationships, or create an arrogant bubble of social selectivity. It is a call to be honest about what the current environment is building or destroying. Do the conversations that happen frequently revolve around opportunities, growth, and solutions, or around complaints, comparisons, and conformity? Do the people closest to you encourage movement, challenge carefully, and push comfort zones, or do they reinforce the idea that the world is dangerous and it's better not to take risks? These questions have no right or wrong answer on paper, but they have real consequences in the trajectory of anyone who ignores them. Curating your environment doesn't necessarily mean finding millionaire mentors or joining elite circles. It means, above all else, being intentional about what enters your mind every day. The content consumed, the podcasts listened to, the books read, the channels followed, all of this composes a mental environment that is just as influential as the physical people around you. A person who doesn't find growth references in their immediate social circle can intentionally build that environment through what they choose to consume, study, and practice. Books, in this sense, serve a role that goes beyond transferring information. They place the mind in direct contact with the way other people think, solve problems, and interpret reality. People who have often been in the exact same place the reader is now and who found ways out that the reader hasn't been able to see yet. This expands the internal repertoire, and an expanded internal repertoire changes what a person can perceive as possible for their own life. But perceiving what's possible, building a favorable environment, and developing practical knowledge still leaves one fundamental piece without a place. And without this piece, everything built up to here tends to collapse the first time reality pushes back with force. The missing piece isn't inspiration. It's not a new method or a new technique. The missing piece, in most cases, is the discipline to execute what you already know needs to be done, even without the desire, even without the energy, even when the situation feels unjust and the effort feels like it isn't paying off. This is the point where most people stop. And stopping here is exactly what keeps scarcity exactly where it is. Blaming the government, the economy, or past circumstances is understandable. Those difficulties are real. But there is a fundamental difference between acknowledging that the context was difficult and using that context as a permanent justification for not acting. The first is honesty, the second is a comfortable prison, because at least inside it, the person doesn't have to take responsibility for what hasn't changed. Adults who build real results do what needs to be done regardless of how they're feeling. Not because they're superhuman, but because they've understood that the feeling is temporary and the consequence of inaction is lasting. Writing goals on paper, reviewing them regularly, and looking at mistakes without becoming defensive, this is applied discipline. But here, there is a layer that goes beyond external execution, one that most people ignore because it requires a different kind of courage. While a person is busy correcting plans and adjusting strategies, there is an internal voice operating in parallel, commenting on everything, judging everything, anticipating failures before they happen. This voice is rarely questioned in any depth, because it feels so integrated into the experience of being who one is that the person simply takes it as truth. But that voice wasn't born with the person. It was built over years of experiences absorbed in environments that weren't always safe or encouraging. Every message that conveyed that wanting too much was arrogance, that dreaming big was naivety, or that feeling was weakness, was deposited into the mind of a child who had no tools to filter what they received. They absorbed it. And what was absorbed became belief, became the lens through which reality was interpreted decades later. Bentov understood consciousness as a system that operates based on programs installed by experience, patterns that continue running automatically long after the original situation has passed. One of the most sophisticated mechanisms of these programs is projection, the tendency to attribute to the external world what is actually being generated internally. The person who feels anger toward those who have more is, deep down, in conflict with their own belief that they don't deserve to have. Recognizing this isn't easy, but it is liberating in a way that no external technique can replicate. Taking responsibility for your own judgment means stopping using others as a distorted mirror and beginning to ask what that reaction reveals about yourself. That question, asked honestly, opens space for something that most adults still haven't done completely: receiving with compassion the inner child who was hurt and who still influences decisions today as if the original danger were still present. Receiving that part of yourself isn't sentimentality, it's integration. It's recognizing that limiting behaviors don't come from adult weakness, but from survival strategies created at a time when there was no other choice. And it is precisely at this point of integration that something begins to emerge with clarity. Every person carries a unique set of talents and capacities that were not developed by accident. They are aligned with a purpose, with an archetypal code that was always there, covered over by layers of imposed beliefs. Discovering that code is the process of removing what was imposed and finding what was always genuine. But living aligned with that purpose comes at a cost that few are willing to pay. It will disappoint people. It will contradict expectations. It will break roles that were assigned throughout life. Accepting that disappointing others is part of the purpose is not arrogance. It is maturity. It is the understanding that no truly fulfilled life was ever built by trying to gain everyone's approval at the same time. Everything presented here is worth nothing kept in memory as information. It is only worth something when it becomes action. The question that remains is simple and direct. What is going to change starting today? Not tomorrow, not next week. Today. Scarcity doesn't disappear with knowledge. It disappears with decision. And the most important decision is to stop waiting until you're ready to begin. If this content made sense, if it touched something real, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what you've seen here is only the beginning.